Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gregory Coward, and tonight I'm here to talk to you about why people prefer nonverbal communication. I would like to start us off with a simple question. Do you respond more to a verbal speech or a nonverbal action? Whatever cue you use more is what you're more likely to notice and give a response to accordingly. Sometimes you will hear a verbal statement, others you may see a nonverbal cue, prompting a response. People usually do not have a preference when it comes to simple communication, and that is okay. However, you will notice that certain individuals around you will have a preference eventually. Some people, when faced with situations, respond appropriately to nonverbal communication rather than simple words. First, I would like to bring up a personal experience I had back in middle school. I personally see this as my very first memorable experience with, as if it was the first time it came to mind. Back in middle school, we had a particular pizza date at my middle school, Broca Shelter. The students were in a much disorganized line. Now it was pizza day, so I can't really blame them on that. Pizza day was one of the most popular days in the week, and it was very rare. A few minutes passed, and security at the school, we call them monitors, they began using verbal cues and words and trying to get us to form an orderly line. I was an obedient student, so I usually did as told and tried getting into a space in line. However, one monitor noticed that the boys were not doing as told and continued to fight to get ahead. Therefore, he decides to act in a more nonverbal way and begin pushing the boys outside the lunchroom. This was his attempt at solving the problem, and it worked as people began falling into line, figuratively and literally. The monitor also pushed me down, but he seemed stressed, so I let it go. Quite memorable for a first experience with nonverbal cues, am I right? Secondly, I would like to bring up a source I found in my class textbook about nonverbal communication. The specific section I picked out talks about how gestures are easier to use compared to verbal cues. According to the Engelberg and Wind Think Communication textbook, gesturing can also ease the mental effort required with communication is difficult. For example, we tend to gesture more when using a language that is less familiar or when describing a picture that a listener cannot see. When addressing a situation we are either not familiar with or uncomfortable with, we tend to use body gestures as a way to convey our messages toward people. Certain examples of body gestures commonly used would be the head tilt, finger point, or eyebrow raising. Quite popular and can be used with words to help express the meaning behind them. They can also use gestures in response to a question or statement, thus making it easier to communicate for those as to why. Our second source is a website known as IPL.org with an essay about the pros and cons of nonverbal communication. This article went on to quote Albert Mehrabian, a professor of psychology. The quote continues, according to Mehrabian, as cited in Anderson 1986, nonverbal messages make up approximately 93% of the meaning of human interaction, while only 7% is from verbal messages. It further talks about the gestures mentioned earlier, as well as a bit of fidgeting, facial expressions, and others as possible indicators of a tone shift through nonverbal communication. Our third source is another article by G.B. Dunning from the University of Nebraska. He also quotes Mehrabian, but he goes into further detail behind the meaning of human interaction. In the article, the quote is as follows: "The tendency to underestimate the importance of nonverbal communication in human interaction may be countered by citing the findings of Mehrabian, 1968. Measuring verbal and vocal language modalities and combining these channels with the facial language modality, he found the total message was 55% facial, 38% vocal, and 7% verbal. The citation talks about the research done 18 years prior to the previous website and goes into more detail, saying that nonverbal communication is majorly with facial expressions. Going through everyday life, I see enough examples to agree with these findings. As people tend to switch between verbal and nonverbal communication, they are likely to use facial expressions and hand gestures together, sometimes with or without the little bit of words they planned to say prior to the change. Lastly, going back to the textbook mentioned earlier, I brought up a couple statistical research that I found and thought to be accurate today. The first one was that researchers estimate that as much as 60 to 70%, or about 2/3, of the meaning we generate in our messages are through nonverbal behaviors. Nonverbal behavior tends to involve hand gestures, facial expressions, body movements, etc. Therefore, the textbook further supports Mehrabian and his theory on nonverbal cues. We also have a second statistic found in the book about physical appearance. The quote mentioned as such: "The researchers found that touch can signal at least 6 emotions: anger, fear, disgust, love, gratitude, and sympathy." Equally important, the accuracy rates for identifying these emotions ranged from 48 to 83%, which is about the same as our ability to identify emotions from observing facial expressions and listening to vocal expression. This implies that the difficulty identifying these emotions and facial expressions varies depending on each person. The question would be if it were possible to train your mind's eye to identify these emotions or expressions easier. So to recap, today's discussion was about nonverbal communication through cues, expressions, and gestures that were preferred over verbal communication. Through some research, we learned that using nonverbal communication is actually more common than we anticipated, with communication being 55% facial, 38% vocal, and 7% verbal. We have determined that nonverbal communication is like second nature. Just as easy as it is to breathe, it is as easy to use hand gestures or facial expressions along with everyday words as we communicate with others. This brings up another question for another time. How much different would communication be if we used only nonverbal cues without the use of words? Have a nice day, everyone.